All right. We'll kick it off here today. Everybody here, thanks for attending. What we're going to be going through today is some workflow tips and tricks. Over the years, as I've worked with people and kind of talked to them and set up their workflows in various situations, I've realized a lot of the same sort of questions come up, and the workflow itself does seem a little bit intimidating when you first open it up. So I just kind of wanted to go through and show some things that I think are helpful for most the types of users that use the Fidesic workflow, and really just kind of help people out and try to make things a bit more transparent. Um, some housekeeping type things on this before we get started here today. We are open to questions. So if you've got a question, you can type it in the chat and I'll be able to see that. If you want to schedule like a session to kind of go into greater detail, or if you've got some new ideas for how we can do better on these sorts of training things, definitely send us an email to support@Fidesic. Any feedback is greatly appreciated. And finally, this meeting is being recorded. So if you've got a question that's specific to your organization and you don't want that being on a training video that we post up online, maybe schedule a custom session, but obviously general sort of questions I'm happy to answer here today. So what I'll be doing is I'll be kind of bouncing back between the questions that I have prepared here and the actual Fidesic itself to kind of show you what we're working about. So the first vast majority, most common question, most common request that we get in our workflow is how do we replace a user? There's two cases where that's important. There's if somebody's going on vacation and you need to replace somebody temporarily, and then there's if you need to replace somebody permanently because there's been a change in that position. We do have a tool that handles both of those. So while this is a workflow question, really you shouldn't have to do a whole lot on the workflow to actually take care of this. And I think you'll see what I mean shortly here. So I'm logged into my test account here, just full of test data, not a whole lot going on. It should be pretty simplistic. Obviously, your individual workflows might be different or more complicated than this, but we'll kind of talk it through and kind of explain how things work out. So the main thing that we want to talk about is that reassign approvals using our built-in function. So you can access this from two ways. We recently added this button right to this page, as this is sort of the most common request here. Is if you want to just replace somebody in the workflow, you can click that and it'll take you to the actual page that takes care of it. Or from the manage users page here, there's a reassign approvals vacation tools button right here. And when you click that, that'll pop up some different options. So for the vast majority of your types of changes that need to be made to the workflow, this tool should be able to take care of it for you. So common case, right? Somebody goes on vacation. Let's start with that. So we've only got a handful of users here, but we'll say that our friend, the controller, is going on vacation and needs to be replaced with AP at Fidesic. So these are two different users. Your case may vary in terms of what users you want to replace. And then we want to determine, is this just for current approvals? This toggle here will send all current pending invoices to this one user to another. So if you just need to move current pending invoices, this is a great tool for that too. And if you actually want to update the workflow, you can check this workflow tab here, or this future tab here, and this will update the workflow automatically. When we set this up, obviously we've got the next prompt, which is this temporary vacation or time off? If it is, enable that, and you can set a start and end date on this, and this will basically just only apply these changes during this time frame, and then it will revert the workflow to the way it was. So if we want to make a change to this, we can replace controller with AP. We'll simply click save on that. Anything that was in that controller queue will now be sent to AP. And if we go check out that workflow that we looked at before, anything that was set to controller, which I think I had this rule set to that before, is now set to AP. So that updated the workflow without you having to make any specific changes to it. Obviously, in a workflow this small, that's this simple, it's not really that big of a difference between coming here and editing it and doing so from this, actual replacement tool page. But this has two different advantages. One, obviously, you can move current invoices or payments, which is great. Something I haven't mentioned. Everything I say today is basically going to apply to payments as well. So you have the ability to move those current invoices over, and you have the ability to set up a timer to expire. And then the final big benefit is if you've got sort of a more complicated workflow than this, where users show up in multiple locations. There's a whole lot of different stages going on here. That'll replace all of them. So you don't have to go through and change multiple rules. All you'll have to go through and do is make that pick what user you want to replace with. So that honestly, that takes care of like 90% of the requests that we get. So that's probably the most important thing that I wanted to make sure that we got here today. So that's the first part. So second part is how to change an existing rule that we have set up. So this is the alternate way to sort of change how a rule functions. Again, in most cases, hopefully you'll be able to use that replace user tool, and that will take care of mostly what you want. But there are obviously going to be situations where there's like a change in the rule, so you need to make a modification directly in the workflow itself. So to do that, it's extremely simple. On every workflow rule that's built into the system, you have an options tab here, and you'll be able to edit this rule. So if we want to go here and edit it, we'll pop open our edit rule stage, which is going to be exactly the same as if we add a new rule, which I'll show you a little later on. But you can change who this needs to go to. So in this case, we can set this back to the controller because we made a permanent change before. If our GL segment here equals 400, then we're going to be routed to that controller. So editing rules should be extremely simple. And I just wanted to highlight that that is an easy option for people to be able to do. Even if you're not exactly sure how things are routing in the workflow, it should be pretty easy to figure out what's going on and just go in and actually make an edit to the rule. Something that should be available directly on this page soon enough, but for the time being, highly recommend for the more complicated workflows. If you do like a Control or Command F on this and then type in the rule that you're looking for, it'll jump you right to there in this page and show you exactly what rule you're looking for. It's super valuable to have that just to be able to figure out, if you're looking for code 400 and you want to see all instances of it, just do a Command F, look for that 400, and you'll be able to find all instances in there if you need to make modifications just to that. So that's super, hopefully a very straightforward thing there. So, biggest question that I get while setting up workflows and kind of how we're setting this up is almost every rule in our system has the ability to set it up as an unhandled rule. And almost nobody intuitively knows what that means. So if you are familiar with programming or development at all, it's really the else statement in how things are set up. So if a rule equals true, you send it to the approver. And then if you were to write a program for this, you'd have an else statement that sends it to a different branch if none of the clauses are true. So there could be multiple things that are true. And then if everything is not true, if none of the true statements happen, then we go to our else clause and route it accordingly. So in a example here, I've set up a really common way that this occurs. So our first stage of approval here is going to be based on vendor number. So it's very common for people to set up different vendors that go to people, go to specific approvers. Obviously, if you know that a travel company needs to go to a particular user, you can do so. What we have here is our unhandled statement, which is also occurring in this stage. And then we've got a rule built on top of that. So we could have as many if vendor equals rules built into the system. There could be 100 of them. And if none of those rules happen, that's when this unhandled rule will come into its use. So anything connected to this rule is only going to be triggered if none of the other rules in this previous stage made sense or were triggered or activated. So in our example, if it's Ace Travel, it'll go to this approver right here. If it's any other vendor, it's going to be routed through this branch. And if it's also has a GL segment equal to 400, it's going to require a secondary approver. So this rule is only ever going to come up in the case that none of the vendor-based rules match. The reason this is super common to do it in this way, especially with this layout with the vendor type rule, is most places have like a list of vendors that they'll need approval on. And then if not, then it goes into like a sort of bigger workflow engine. So The way I had it worded is sent to a different branch. And usually there's quite a big branch that's going to be built off of this. So you could have all your different location codes. You could have department codes. You could have really anything that you would use for sort of a larger workflow setup can be built on top of this. And then all of those rules are only going to trigger if none of the vendor rules match. So it's a super powerful tool that when I'm setting up workflow, I use almost every single time. Um, and really, it allows you to have sort of two entirely different branches of workflows. You can have something built off of if no vendor matches, and you can have a whole section built off of just vendor matches. And in case it's not obvious, you don't have to make this based on vendor. You can have unhandled rules based on any stage that you've got set up here. So you can use that sort of logic anywhere in the workflow to build it out and reroute accordingly. So another thing that's built into the system that I realize not a lot of people know about and know how to set up is we do support either or approvals. That's built-in function to Fidesic. So there are obviously going to be cases where you have invoices that come in and they need to go to one of two people. Whoever it goes to, it might be whoever gets to it first. It might be that they have some internal logic that can't be scripted to know who needs to approve things. But we do have the ability to route directly to more than one approver at the same time. And then whoever gets to it will be the one who actually gets to it. So to apply that to a rule that already exists, we can just go to our edit rule function like I showed you earlier. And then we'll have a button here that's add additional approvers to this rule. So if we click that, we can go through and add an entirely different person to this invoice and then, or to this invoice rule. And once we save it, we now have AP admin or the controller. What that is going to mean is that when this rule happens, both parties will have an invoice added to their approval queue, and both parties will be notified that there is an invoice in their queue. When one of them comes into the system and approves it, that is enough to satisfy this rule, and it will move on to the next part of the process. So again, in cases where it doesn't really matter who gets to it, as long as somebody gets to it, this is a great thing to set up. This is super common or super popular on the payment side of things, where you'll have your 3 check signers, and then whoever signs it is, or whoever approves it is the one who actually gets to sign the document and let that payment move along its way. So super common way to set things up on the payment side. Also powerful on the invoicing side as well. It allows you to, kind of assign multiple people, and then whoever gets to it, which of course leads into the next sort of rule that we can add in, which is an inline approval, which is sort of the opposite of the either or approval. And if we wanted this exact same situation that we were just looking at, we'll make that inline. I'll delete this approver from this rule, and then I'll make a new branch off this. So we'll add a rule. We'll select equals, and we'll then set this as our controller approver. So because these rules are identical, and because these rules both exist in the same stage, in this case, this is going to behave very similarly to the other case that we just showed you, where the approvers are going to be assigned at the same time. They're going to be notified at the same time. The difference is in this setup, they're both going to have to approve it before it can move on to the next stage. So in the other case, obviously only one of them had to. In this case, it will require both. So this is our inline approval. Just make sure that the rules are identical, and then we can set it up to function that way. So I've mentioned a couple times, if you have questions, throw them in the chat and we can get to them now. There were a couple other things that sort of didn't fit into like a larger topic that I wanted to talk about that we'll go through here. So I have this example built out in a very specific way to kind of highlight how this works. And so sort of the main thing to keep in mind when looking at this workflow is to follow the lines to see how these rules are connected together. And then the general rule with how the workflow operates is when it gets to the end of a stage, it's going to go back to the start and check again to see if any other rules need to be applied. So for this rule, which is just sort of floating on its own, we have Ace Travel. An example invoice from Ace Travel would come to this invoice. It would come out here, and then it's going to go back to the start and see if anything else is required. So we've already got our approval for this stage here, so nothing else is required here. It's then going to move to the next required rule. So it'll check this rule, the unhandled, which won't trigger because obviously that only happens when this rule does not trigger, as we talked about in sort of the first example that we have. But this other rule down here is going to be relevant. So if we have a invoice for Ace Travel that is over $5,000, it's first going to come here, get to the end, loop back around, and then check this and go, oh, it's greater than $5,000 too. We also need this approval to move on to get it into a fully approved status. Similar example works here. So if we are in that unhandled, if it's not from Ace Travel, it's going to check this. If it's a 400, it's going to go back to the top and then check, is it Ace Travel? No. Is it unhandled? Yes, but we've already gone through that. And then it'll move down to this rule again and check over 5,000. So if it was not Ace Travel from 400 and over 5,000, it's going to require these two approvers. Then it's going to loop back, go, and then check this stage 3 rule. Now, the way to build this is with this add rule button that we have here. So where you add the rule in the workflow does matter. So if I were to add a rule here, it's only going to take place if this clause is also true. So it's only when this clause is true. It doesn't matter what stage I add it to. These rules are going to be connected. So if I were to add a rule here to stage 3 for things that were over $1,000, let's say, this rule is only going to happen if this rule is also true, because these rules are connected. I did the add rule from here. That makes these rules connected. This rule is independent. Despite being in the same stage, this rule is not connected to any previous rule. And the way that I did that is just by adding it from the start here, add to stage 3, and then we can throw another rule in here, like $10,000, let's say. So these rules are not a part of any other branch. So like I mentioned, you can think of it in loops. When it gets to the end of this stage, it's going to go check back and see if anything else applies. So anything that's added to the first stage here, it doesn't matter what stage you add it in, it's going to be connected to that start, which means we're going to check that again when it goes back for its loop to check. So this is super powerful in construction of workflows because you don't have to have tons and tons of redundant rules in place. I see people when they build this themselves, they would have a case like this, then they'd have a separate vendor, and then they'd have this rule again added on. And, you know, there could be dozens or even 100 rules like that, where the smart thing to do, if this is going to be the case on every subsequent rule, just add this once at the bottom like I've done here. So we don't need to add this stage 3 to every single rule, to every single branch. If we add it to the start, when it gets to the end, it's going to loop back around and check that again. So that's probably the most, it's one of the most important things, and it's sort of tough to visualize without somebody saying, and it gets to the end and loops back around. It was definitely the thing that took me the longest to fully internalize about this workflow when I was learning it initially. But it's also one of the most powerful things because it allows you to avoid redundant rules. So these rules apply to pretty much everything. It's super common to have like an accounts payable person in this sort of position where they approve things at the end of every single, possible branch that you've built in here. And so it's going to keep looping until all the rules have been exhausted. It's either been assigned or ruled out. So it's just the way to think about it. And I already sort of touched on that. Rules built on top of rules are really the key to everything. That's what we talked about here, where any rules that are added will show up as an additional rule here. So like I mentioned, that's sort of all I was hoping to get through. We're trying to keep this short, trying to keep it just down to what matters. If you've got specific questions, again, feel free to file them in here. I can talk about anything. But if you got questions specific to your company, let me know. and we will definitely schedule some time to do that. Just shoot us an email, send it to support at Fidesic, and we'll be happy to answer things. So, and like I mentioned at the top, any feedback you have on these sorts of things would be much appreciated too. We're going to start trying to do more training like this. And all of these videos will be available on our YouTube after the fact. So if you're in attendance here, we'll send you a copy of this by email once we're through. So thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day. And depending on where you are, have a good lunch break. And thanks again. Take care.